Okay, this is Behavioural Economics on a Post-it, number 20, the Anchoring Heuristic. So since this is the 20th of these short little videos, I plan to do 40 in total. So, I think you would deduce from that this marks the halfway point. I'll continue doing these little videos even if nobody watches them. I guess you could say that I'm a victim of the sunk cost fallacy. Once I've started something, I've got to finish it. They'll come in useful for me, I think, even if they don't come in useful for anybody else. Now, the anchoring heuristic. This is a very important rule of thumb, I think. Very important in terms of observations in the field of behavioural economics over, decades now. A lot of these heuristics, these rules of thumb, these behavioural phenomena that I talk about, many of you might think, okay, that's just common sense, but they do have implications that are inconsistent with standard economic theory or standard rational choice theory, which itself has been hugely influential over government policy. So, that's the importance, really. That's the importance of sort of studying these types of things. We talked a little bit about the anchoring heuristic in relation to preference reversals. If you remember, possibly the most respected explanation for those preference reversals, for why people tend to value the dollar bet more than the p bet, but then choose the p bet over the dollar bet in direct pie-wise choice, is that people anchor when they're asked for their willingness to pay, or the maximum amount they're willing to pay for the individual lottery tickets or the individual bets. With the dollar bet, they might anchor on the outcome that you win, and because that's a relatively large outcome, it might lead them to overstate, if you like, their willingness to pay for that particular gamble, the relatively small chance of winning the large monetary amount. And if you think about that, if that is happening, then that has implications for all sorts of government policy appraisal, which is, quite often driven by willingness to pay exercises in cost-benefit analysis. So that, I think, is something to think about. But back to specifically to what I'm going to talk about in terms of the anchoring heuristic today, in this particular little video. I've just written a description, basically, of the implication of the anchoring heuristic in the bottom here. Anchoring, when people offer answers to questions, they are often influenced by, or they can be influenced by, entirely irrelevant cues. So they've anchored on something else that could be entirely irrelevant to the decision that they're being faced with, and that could influence their decision, right? Now, I think one of the issues with measuring these types of heuristics and saying that people might be silly to do those sorts of things is that sometimes the scenarios are very contrived. They're very contrived, and people would only be silly really in those very contrived circumstances. As I've said before, there may be very good reasons for why people act or behave or influenced by these heuristics, these rules of thumb. And it's only if you present them with very contrived circumstances that their behaviours do seem to be quite silly. But nonetheless, they are sometimes quite useful for just sort of demonstrating these phenomena at work, right? So I made up a scenario here again to sort of illustrate the point. I've not tested it, but it's sort of, it's a hypothesis that people might be influenced by an entirely irrelevant cue when they're being asked a question about something, right? So if I was to ask you to think of your house number, and if I was to ask a large number of people to think of their house number, And then I was to ask them, how many goals do you think that Lionel Messi scored in the last 2 seasons in total without checking, right? Now, most people, I think, wouldn't be able to guess with any degree of accuracy how many goals Lionel Messi has scored in the last 2 seasons, although some people would, no doubt. But most people wouldn't, right? So the hypothesis with anchoring is that those people, on average, with relatively high numbers in terms of their house number, high house numbers, would guess that, on average, Lionel Messi had scored more goals in the last 2 seasons than those people with relatively lower house numbers, right? That would be the hypothesis. It might be sort of an interesting little study for you to test out on a few people if you wish, right? That is to say, you can see that the entirely irrelevant cue might influence people's answers to this particular football-related question. I apologise if I've introduced too many football-related questions. I'm not particularly a huge fan of football, but I just thought they'd be quite convenient to illustrate some of these phenomena with these types of things. I think Dan Ariely and Draws and Prolich, I think they did a series of studies where they asked people similar sorts of questions to these. So I think in the American context, they asked people to think about their social security number, and then they asked people to think about how much they would be willing to pay for a particularly nice bottle of wine, and for various other goods as well. And they found that people with think of the last 2 digits, the 2 digits of their social security numbers, I think it was, and people with relatively high numbers in their social security digits were willing to pay significantly more for the nice bottle of wine than people with low social security digits. So you can see again, it's relatively easy to manipulate people's answers by getting them to focus or anchor upon entirely irrelevant cues. Okay, so that's behavioural economics on a post-it number 20, the anchoring heuristic.